Hello, lovely Tech Sister listeners. Welcome to the second episode of Tech Sis, your trusted companion on your journey through the tech world. I'm your host, Kate Emery, and today we're going to talk a little bit about Grace Hopper 2023. Yeah, I know, we're going there. So get comfortable and let's talk about what wound up being a very different experience than most years. So for starters, it's important for me to mention that this is actually the fourth time that I've gone to Grace Hopper. The third time that I've gone in person as well. So I have a decent amount of experience with it. With that in mind, I had seen that there was kind of a need for students to get advice on how to navigate Grace Hopper. It's a huge conference. There's so many companies there, and honestly, it's incredibly overwhelming the first time that you attend. For me, I didn't go with my college ever, and this year I didn't go with my company. So I've always gone solo and largely been on my own to find resources to help me navigate this giant conference of about 20 to 30,000 people on most years. With that in mind, I've learned a lot about how to make the best of your Grace Hopper the hard way. So I decided to start a series of posts to help other women and my non-binary technologists make the most out of their Grace Hopper experience. Having gone so many times, there's just so many pieces that you learn. So this was a different Grace Hopper for me going into it because this was the first time that I had graduated and had a job. I have attended Grace Hopper multiple times as a student, and last year, Grace Hopper 2022, I attended as somebody who had graduated a month before the conference and was still looking for my first time full-time job after graduating. I am one of those great stories of somebody who interviewed on site and actually got an offer before the end of Grace Hopper in 2022. And that's when my journey out Boeing started. So let's talk about this year because everybody's talking about it. A ton of organizations and journalists who have never really talked much about Grace Hopper are suddenly talking about it based on this year. And that leaves the question of why. And if it was nearly as bad as they're making it out to be, or if this is just some sensationalism occurring. So let's talk about the elephant in the room that I'm kind of dreading talking about, but honestly is really important this time. There were a lot of cis men at Grace Hopper this year. And typically there are not that many. Typically they are either actually there with their companies actively recruiting, or they're attending sessions and learning and growing, and they're there really as allies. And they're rare. In my 3 previous Grace Hoppers, I had only ever seen one guy in line at the career fair. Obviously, it could be wrong, but I had at least been able to say that I had only ever had one person who presented as a male. And so it was jarring to go to the expo hall preview night and to go in with intent of kind of like talking to other companies, figuring out what they have going on, seeing, all of the fun booths. It's always so fun at Grace Hopper historically to just go see what people did. Companies do such fun booths every single year. Disney brings in this bedazzled Minnie Mouse with a laptop. It's great. One year Target brought the Target dog that does in fact have like bullseye dye job. It's so fantastic and it's so fun, except for this year. And That's heartbreaking for me to say. But I went in to preview night expecting to just have fun, enjoy, seeing what companies decided to do for the celebration of women in technology that Grace Hopper is. Instead, I couldn't focus on that because I was so busy noticing that there were a lot of guys. And the thing is that not only were there a lot of guys, there were a lot of guys who were just being point blank rude. And I don't go to Grace Hopper to get shoved, quite frankly. I don't go to Grace Hopper to be interrupted by a man. It's actually kind of exactly why I pay to go to Grace Hopper, is to not have that for 1 week, for just a few days, to not have some guy think he innately deserves more than me. And I never had a problem with Grace Hopper feeling like a safe space until this year. And my very first kind of eye-opening experience of this year being just very, very, very different was I found a table towards the back of the expo hall just to take a break. I was talking to a few grad schools and I wanted to put the materials in my backpack so that I didn't drop them or lose them or anything. And I wound up sitting at a table with a few students, and we started talking because for a lot of students who haven't seen people's posts about Grace Hopper, this is incredibly overwhelming. There's hundreds of companies. How in the world do you go about talking to them? There's thousands of people talking to them. And so I was just talking to a few students. I wound up with a table of 3 women who were all career changers, much like myself. I used to work in education. And I was so excited to get to just talk to these women about how to make the best out of this experience, even though I had already noticed change. And we had a guy come up to us. And he looked me dead in the eye and he said, "What's your elite coach strategy?" and practically demanded it of me. And interrupted me mid-sentence, which once again is exactly why I go to Grace Hopper, to not have that happen. And I'd like to say that I told him that interrupting was rude. I'd like to say that I stood up for myself, that I stood up for this valuable conversation with these other women, but that wouldn't be true. One of the things that's really hard to explain to people who haven't been the minority somewhere is that sometimes, and honestly, a lot of the times, it feels easier to just comply and hope that it will stop. So when I had my elite code strategy practically demanded of me, I was like, what does that even mean? I don't have one. Partially because I actually work in industry, so I don't actively grind elite code. Also because I think there's a lot of toxic culture involving elite code, and I'll talk about that on the later podcast, but that I don't have some strategy. And so I basically told this guy, and he refused to leave and demanded how many elite code problems I've ever done. I genuinely have no idea. I think I said probably 5 ever. Which is probably correct, technically, but it's not the complete truth. And thankfully, he went away. But you could tell that the bubble of just women connecting had been burst. All of a sudden, the table had a completely different feel. And I couldn't get that back. And I felt okay about myself at the end of the day. I didn't feel bad about my self-worth. I kind of, in his tone of voice and his body language, felt like he was trying to make me seem smaller. But at the end of the day, one person in that interaction had an industry badge. One of us had a job, and that's me. And so, no, you're not going to make me feel littler because I don't have a lead coach strategy. It's not going to happen. But it took me years to get there. It also took the fact that my husband is a senior engineer at Google who also does not have a lead coach strategy. So, that was how preview night went. And I had also been stopped by a group of people wanting to give me their resumes. And one of the things that was, that I was pretty firm on with my Grace Hopper experience is that I was not paid by my company to be there. Therefore, I was doing zero work for them. I was on unpaid leave. I was not accepting resumes and handing them off to Boeing. Period. Work-life boundaries are incredibly important to me. And if I'm not being paid for my time, I will not do work. And there were a lot of people who weren't accepting of that. And so from the very, very, very first night, I knew this was going to be a very different Grace Hopper. So, unfortunately, a lot of those behaviors continued. We had the chief impact officer speak and open up the first day. Shout out to him. He's awesome. I've wound up chatting with him a few times at this point. And basically saying like, hey, stop. Just stop. Like if you're here and you're a cis man, your job is to be an ally and just quit trying to take opportunities from women. Because like the number of opportunities you get that we don't, like just stop. And unfortunately, a lot of sessions were largely empty, including ones that would have been incredibly useful for all of these students and people working on getting their career in place. And that included the opening ceremony. Because this year, Grace Hopper decided to open the career fair before opening ceremony, which in my recollection, they haven't done previously. So a lot of people were there, including employees of companies who were recruiting who probably wanted to be in opening ceremony. So that is on my long list of things that I have given feedback to Anita Borg Institute on. Hopefully we change next year. But ultimately, my experience was really different this year. Not looking for a job got me out of what was the worst of it. But because I had tried to mentor and kind of help along those coming after me, I heard a lot of stories and I saw a lot of things that broke my heart. So we're going to talk about them. We're going to talk about a little bit of some of the things that people thought would help and why they may or may not help. And ultimately, what each of us can do to potentially make situations like this less likely to happen in the future, because we can't fix the experiences that occurred. Unfortunately, we can't take those back. But what we can do is we can try and prevent it from occurring in the future. So that's my goal, is to help make that happen. Just for clarity's sake, I in no way, shape, or form am currently affiliated with the Anita Borg Institute or Grace Hopper in any way, shape, or form. I pay for my ticket just like everybody else. I attend just like everybody else. I have no special ways to communicate with them or anything like that. So just know that this is coming from a completely attendee perspective. So let's get started on our chat a little. So first of all, one of the things that came up a lot was a concept of banning men. So I'm going to try and be really clear about this in a lot of ways. One, they straight up cannot. It's illegal. Period. End of conversation, quite frankly. We cannot have a nonprofit breaking the law to discriminate when literally their point is to stop discrimination. That we cannot do that, period. But this spoke to a toxicity towards men that needed to stop. And if you're one of the people who thought that because you had a bad experience in the expo hall with a few men, that there were no men on site worth your time, that's not okay. There's a lot of guys who are really supportive and really wonderful. They just weren't trying to get jobs. I wound up with one in one of my sessions who, if I remember correctly, and I don't work for T-Mobile, so I don't know the exact, I might misremember pieces or, have some of the information incorrect. But I wound up in line with this guy who works for T-Mobile and their women's group every year, from what he told us and what I remember now a few weeks later, basically votes for a male ally who's worked with their women's group who would benefit from going to Grace Hopper and just going to sessions, talking to other women, getting their experiences, seeing what's working at their companies, and basically would take the Grace Hopper experience and be an even better ally for it. And I don't remember his name, but he was the sweetest guy. He was almost in tears over how honored he was to be accepted as an ally and recognized as a good ally. We don't want guys like that to feel like we hate them because of guys like the ones in the career fair who are shoving people. We need our allies because it's exhausting. It's exhausting to always be the one to have to speak up. Sometimes it's really nice to have an ally who doesn't have to speak up for themselves and has a little bit less emotional investment in the situation and who is there to support you. And so we have to be really cautious that any changes that are made, one, are legal, but two, also do encourage our actual allies. One of my greatest mentors was gonna go to Grace Hopper last year, and he's a guy. And he was gonna be doing recruiting with Google there. And I can say that he's a phenomenal ally. And I wouldn't want to go to a conference that he wasn't welcome just because he's a guy. Even if it's a conference for women that there are men who are feeding into our careers and who are helping fight against the fact that we haven't gotten those opportunities. And we need to be conscientious of them. Because I saw a lot of people get hurt emotionally in kind of the crossfire of what happened at Grace Hopper. And that genuinely breaks my heart. One of the other things is that I had a lot of students, especially because they were the ones that I was primarily interacting with who were in the conference, like in the expo hall, who would tell me that they were kind of being openly hostile towards men. And the thing is, that doesn't help. I fully understand being upset. I totally get it. But one of the things that's really important as well is that Grace Hopper isn't just about women. It's about non-binary. And how do you know? How do you know that you're not just being a jerk to somebody who's male presenting, non-binary, and is actually a great person. I highly doubt that when behaving in these ways that we're asking people, because that is an uncomfortable conversation. And I would say, like, when in doubt, just ignore to the best of your ability. And, don't escalate the situation to the best of your ability in these very unique situations, unfortunately. And I hate that that's my advice. I wish I had better, but there's people who definitely are in the communities that Grace Hopper is intended for who got caught in the crossfire. And that's not the experience we want from them. So one of the big questions when trying to figure out what we can do is, how did we get here? How did we get a conference for women in technology to be, if I had to guess, 40% male, at least in that expo hall? I am going to say that there's a non-zero possibility that I hold some responsibility for this. And I take that really seriously. When I say that, I think that a lot of the Grace Hopper experience at this point that has been written about is the equivalent of survivor bias, where people are writing about getting job offers and interviews on site, and that all of this is happening within the span of a few days. And that when the job market is bad like it is, that all of a sudden desperate people see what sounds like you can just sign up for an interview, or you can just magically buy a ticket and get a job. And I'm going to be the first to say, if I have ever posted something that made it sound that easy, I am so sorry, because that is not true. Yes, I got my job at Grace Hopper last year, but I had gone to Grace Hopper twice before and gotten no offers. And I had applied to hundreds of companies each time. I went in last year with a really pretty solid resume. By the time that I arrived at Grace Hopper, I had done final interviews with Google and Meta and Amazon and Microsoft. Like, I was also good at interviewing. And so I'm not the candidate that only got my offer because I attended Grace Hopper. And there's a lot of people who, when I was talking to them, thought that it was as simple as you buy a ticket to Grace Hopper and you wind up with a job. And that's not true. And I even say that as somebody who doesn't need visa sponsorship, which I know makes things more complicated and more limited, and quite frankly, just harder. And so I can't speak to just how hard it is to get a job in those situations, but I can say that when you attend Grace Hopper, you're looking at, if we say half of the attendees are attending the expo hall, we're talking 10,000 people. The majority of them are going to want to talk to Google and Apple and Meta and Amazon and Microsoft and some of those top tier companies. And so it's you versus 10,000. And yeah, they have more than one job. They have a lot of jobs, but you have to stand out in that. And that's not easy. And so I think that that's one thing that hasn't helped, is that a lot of us are writing about our experiences and not telling how much we've done beforehand. And so you had a lot of desperate people who thought Grace Hopper was this magical wonderland where you sign up for an interview, or you God forbid, sell what you think is an interview. Because I did hear of people's one-on-one chats with recruiters that you could schedule virtually or I guess in person. I believe both this year. But those chats are not interviews, last I checked. You cannot simply buy an interview at Google. I am so sorry to break that news to people who do not understand that. But I did hear from several students that people were selling some of those slots for 4 figures, which is really gross. But like, you can't just buy an interview with those companies. That makes no sense. Less than 0.4% of people who apply to work at Google get the job. That is not that changed by you attending Grace Hopper. It's just not. So I think that that's part of why this happened. Unfortunately, it greatly changed so much of the conference. And the question we're left with is, what can we do? What can we, as the attendees and as the people who have attended, what can we do? So I have a few thoughts. 1, actually give constructive feedback to Anita Borg Institute. Constructive feedback does not include the feedback that we should ban men, which is illegal. That's not helpful. That's white noise that makes it harder for them to find the feedback that actually could potentially have positive impact on the conference, which is what we actually want. So if you have something, if you have an idea, I'm pretty sure there's emails on their website, write them. In my experience, they do want to hear. Before closing ceremonies, I wound up talking to one of their staff members with a group of about 7 other people, and we were giving feedback on it and, how could we improve the conference kind of things. From what I have seen, they do care and they do want to listen. So if you have feedback, give it. From there, we have to make sure that the culture shift happens beyond just Grace Hopper. By that, what I mean is Grace Hopper shouldn't be the only day that you're making friendships with other women in technology. It shouldn't be the only day that you're networking with us. Shouldn't be the only day that we ever hear from you. Get on LinkedIn, find some of us. A lot of us are happy to help those who are coming up behind us. That's actually the whole intent of this podcast. It's just there's a huge mentoring gap between men and women. And I can't mentor everybody, but what I can do is provide a lot of the things that I would provide to a mentee to everybody who wants to listen. So find a group of people, make a group of people. If you're at a college and you don't have a women in CS group, make it. If you're at a company and you don't have it, make the group. That at the end of the day, we change culture on our day-to-day, not during the 3 days of Grace Hopper. If you are one of the students who, or people in general looking for a job who was seriously disappointed with how your Grace Hopper experience went and didn't get to talk to some of the companies you want to talk to, go on LinkedIn and search for recruiters for those companies. Or search for women in software or whatever role you want and write up a LinkedIn message. Actually spend the time to make it clear why you're writing us. Please do not write me and just immediately ask for a referral. My answer to that is always no. But if you didn't get to talk to a recruiter at Boeing about some of the work that we have in software, or you didn't get to talk to anybody about what our interview process is like, it's changed since I did it, but feel free to reach out and I'm happy to help. I've helped probably hundreds of people at this point. And the thing is, there's a lot of other women like me who have been there. And we understand that this year, some of the opportunities that previous attendees of Grace Hopper have gotten, you didn't necessarily get this year. And so if you reach out and ask for some help, we're happy to help. This is a well-known thing this year. So take advantage of that. Reach out to people who work for those companies and ask the questions that you would have wanted to ask a recruiter. We are not recruiters unless our profile says that we're recruiters. So do not ask us to look up jobs for you or something like that, because that's a lot of time. And it's just not what we do. But if you wanted to talk to somebody about what's it like being a woman at Google, find a woman at Google on LinkedIn. Find women at these companies and ask them what's their women at, insert company name here, group like. I've yet to find very many who aren't willing to reply. Sometimes we're very busy. Before Grace Hopper, I think at one point I had like 100 messages in my LinkedIn inbox at once, and go figure, that takes me a little bit to get through. But most of the time, we're willing to help. And so you can take some ownership over some of those gaps. And also, I would include, if you're especially writing a recruiter, like, hey, I attended Grace Hopper. I wanted to talk to your company. And unfortunately, I didn't get to due to how Grace Hopper went this year. Most of them will know what you're talking about. And, in general, following up is a great practice to get into. And most people are happy to help because, as somebody who works for a company who attended, I'm disappointed that we probably didn't get to talk to everybody who wanted to probably talk to us. Because just, wow. And I know that there were companies who had to tell employees, if you're not in the booth, do not talk about the company in any capacity. And that was literally to protect us, because people were going a little too hard on some of us. And I got yelled at by some attendees for not knowing if we offer visas. And I don't know. That's not my job. So at this point, as long as you're respectful, most people will be happy to help. And hopefully we can make it so that our community feels more intact after this experience, because it was hard. It was hard to have what has historically felt like a celebration of women competing feel like it got attacked. It was hard to have every conversation start with an elephant in the room and needing to talk about it. I don't think that I had a single Grace Hopper conversation that didn't start by addressing the feelings of the men. And that sucks. That is not what we want. So it was a really important reminder of the critical nature of having people around you, a network of women with similar experiences or non-binary friends with similar experiences, and making sure that we do the work all the time, that it's not just at Grace Hopper that this happens. And hopefully solutions are found. I'm concerned on how hard it is to actually fix the problem. To be honest, I think that one of the things that I'm hoping to see is more voices who are connected to the student experience and the new grad experience, because historically, a lot of AnitaB.org staff have been later in career, and that's great in a lot of ways because they're experienced, but it's very different being a student or a new grad now than it's ever been before. And so I'm hoping that they find some voices and some people who are happy to help them. And I look forward to seeing what they do because I do genuinely believe that they understand the problem. With that being said, I am going to go ahead and kind of close out today's podcast. Hopefully, this has been helpful to you. Hopefully, you feel a little bit more capable of getting your Grace Hopper experience, kind of reclaiming some of that and some of what you hoped. Thank you for spending time with me on Tech Sis. Remember, you're not alone in this. Stay curious, stay confident. Till next time, I'm here for you. And I hope you enjoyed our conversation, our candid conversation about Grace Hopper 2023. And remember, you are very much not alone. And until next time, peace.